As we continue to see the Russian media make ever more absurd claims, such as yesterday saying that the Polish are going to attack Germany, you have to remember war is almost as much about manipulating perceptions as it is about actual combat. Psychological operations have long played a role in warfare, but with the ever present television, 24-hour news cycle, the internet, social media, such manipulations seem to be taking more and more center stage. Military might absolutely still matters. It certainly does. And Russia's experiencing that. They just don't have the might to execute the goals that they need to execute in Ukraine. But the perceptions of their people, the perceptions of the world community are still critical, and they can be shaped using manipulating operations or misinformation operations. Russia's actions in Ukraine highlight this shift to more of a focus on these manipulations as Putin continues to resort more to political theater to achieve his objectives because his actual force on ground cannot. So, understanding what is happening, his statements with regard to his motivations, is he genuinely warning the West that Russia will use any means necessary to win in Ukraine, including using a nuclear weapon, or is he simply using these threats as a part of a psychological campaign? Right now, Putin's pronouncements seem to fall in that latter category, that it's just psychological campaigning, that he's just trying to present information in order to get the West to back off. However, Western leaders must remain vigilant because any nuclear threat carries the potential for very high consequences. Russia has a long history of using influence operations and political theater as a part of its military strategy. Putin's control over Russia's media and the political apparatus allows him to maintain this unified message, a message that often is far more bombastic, far more devious than what the Kremlin is actually willing to do. And we see that in real time. Mostly what the Kremlin puts out and talks about is far more restrained than what we see in their media. And the problem is upping this ante becomes more difficult for Democrat leaders who have to contend with diverse opinions and interests. We have the freedom to say what we want, and our news outlets on the 24 hours news cycle can say what they want. We see that as we run a very wide gamut of what is acceptable to, say, MSNBC versus what is acceptable to Fox News, and we have this very wide political spectrum, and that is allowed. There is not that political spectrum in Russia by any means. So when Putin talks about his nuclear threats, they play a critical role in his psychological warfare. Since the early years of the Cold War, the risk of a nuclear conflict has limited military force, placing greater emphasis on perceptions of absolute resolve. The Soviets had the resolve to defeat the United States. The United States had the resolve to defeat the Soviets. Same thing's playing out here. Putin is trying to have a greater resolve and prepare his people to have a greater resolve than the West and Ukraine. Putin has tested this resolve for years, seeking to reestablish Russian dominance over the former Soviet Union countries or the Soviet bloc countries. By raising this specter of nuclear warfare, Putin aims to create an alarm in the West and sow divisions within NATO. This is a strategy of terror, and it plays on fear and uncertainty. Putin's nuclear posturing serves to distract from Russia's military failures. We all see the failures, and yet people continuously to quake in their boots at the potential for Russia and the potential to overrun Europe or attack the United States, when in reality that just is not a physical possibility for their country. It also emboldens their hawkish elements within Russia. So those that want escalations, it allows Putin to give them a hat tip or a nod. While I don't think the actual use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine is going to take place, it would mainly because it would just be a dangerous course of action for everyone involved. Russia would be in an absolutely vulnerable position, having spent the last of its political or power, its geostrategic power, and now facing the combined wrath of probably the world, as China likely would take their hands off and say, we're done with you, and Europe and the United States would conduct some sort of response. However, propaganda, which is often dismissed as mere posturing, can be highly effective. Putin doesn't need to convince the West that Russia will use nuclear weapons. He only needs to sow enough doubt to deter the West from escalating the conflict. By exploiting the divisions that we're seeing in NATO, such as those with Hungary or Turkey and kind of even France at this point, Putin is seeking to weaken the alliance and gain an advantage so that he can continue to do what he wants to do, not only in Ukraine, but eventually Moldova and potentially Georgia, as well as, if we are to believe some of his other lackeys, the oligarchs and the media, potentially even the Baltic states or Poland, though I don't think they have the capability to do so. A significant component of Putin's psychological campaign is also preparing the Russian people for the hardships of a potentially lengthy war by framing the conflict as a defense against existential threats such as the West or NATO or Nazis or homosexuals or whatever. Putin taps into a deep well of nationalism, of historical pride, and frankly, a bit of cultural bigotry in a lot of these areas. It also plays well for other nations that dislike the United States, such as China, or even flat out have a hatred of the United States, such as Iran or North Korea. Now, it's difficult to really know how effective Putin's propaganda efforts are within Russia. The suppression of dissent and his control over information make it nearly impossible to accurately gauge public opinion. But it is clear that the Russians are deeply affected by patriotic displays and historical references, as well as plays on their religiosity. But the younger generations are far less susceptible to such tactics. This is why we saw initial protests from young people when the war started, and a mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of them over the last year. The situation in Russia is likely more complex than a simple dichotomy of do you support or oppose. It's a mixture of genuine patriotism, fear of the Kremlin, and uncertainty that shapes their public sentiment. As the conflict drags on, the impact of economic sanctions and the human cost of the war is also influencing public opinion, both within Russia and among its adversaries. So being able to control this narrative absolutely can needle into those areas of uncertainty and try to fill it with the certainty that Russia is all that. It is the best in the world. Western leaders can develop strategies to counteract these efforts, and that's what we should be doing. It involves strengthening internal communication channels, promoting accurate information, and actively working to maintain the unity of the Western Alliance. Understanding Putin's motives behind his rhetoric can help our leaders better anticipate and respond to potential escalations in the conflict. Ultimately, the battle of perceptions is going to play a significant role in determining the outcome of this conflict in Ukraine. The world's perception is that Ukraine has come together, been very strong, and been fighting very passionately, so the Western world is willing to continue to support them, to help them maintain their sovereignty, to win back what they've lost. If that starts to crack, the absolute sludge of propaganda coming from Russia can creep into those cracks and start to separate them. So as the conflict evolves, understanding and addressing the power of the perceptions Putin can use, the perceptions the West can use, will be essential to navigating the complex landscape, not only of Ukraine, but frankly, the future of modern warfare, where we all see everything almost in real time, but also there are tools out there to absolutely fool us, and we need to be more critical thinkers going forward, because as I've said before, the only way to really counter the misinformation that we constantly see coming out of Russia is to reinforce the truth over and over and over as if it's a sledgehammer.